In the quiet, tree-lined neighborhoods of Savannah, Georgia, the humid morning air carried the scent of blooming magnolias and damp earth. Catherine Hughes slipped her plastic employee ID badge into her coat pocket before she even cleared the heavy glass doors of the historic downtown consulting firm where she had worked for the past 3 years. Hiding it felt like a desperate attempt to delay a truth she wasn't ready to face. No one accompanied her to the exit, and no one needed to. The news had been delivered by a young human resources assistant who refused to look Catherine in the eye, speaking in a low, apologetic murmur, as if she were personally responsible for a decision she had merely been handed. Catherine understood the script before the girl could even finish her sentence. She simply nodded, murmured a polite thank you, folded the termination notice into 4 neat identical squares, and tucked it into her purse alongside her monthly transit pass, an item that had suddenly lost its purpose. Outside, the early southern morning remained warm and utterly indifferent. Catherine took a long, deep breath. She did not breathe to cry, but rather to keep herself from crying. At 29 years old, life had already taught her that tears shed in the wrong place were easily mistaken for weakness by those who didn't deserve to see them. She straightened her spine, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the bus stop with the hurried stride of someone who still had a very important place to go. Inside the bus, she pressed her forehead against the cool window pane and watched the cobblestone streets of Savannah slip past. Her mind immediately began running numbers. The rent on her modest cottage was due in exactly 12 days, and her refrigerator held little more than a carton of eggs, a block of cheddar, and half a melon. She performed this mental inventory with a clinical coldness that sometimes frightened her. It felt as though she were calculating the survival of a stranger, but it was her life, and it had always been hers alone to manage. She had no siblings. Her parents had passed away years ago, and whatever distant relatives she had left could be summed up in an occasional, brief holiday card. Perhaps that was why the home of her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Iris Bennett, had become the only sanctuary in the entire world where Catherine could walk through the front door without knocking, confident that someone was waiting for her on the other side. She stepped off the bus 2 stops early, wanting to walk the remaining blocks so the humid Georgia breeze could clear her mind. Her neighborhood was quiet, filled with modest historic cottages, where the wooden fences were low, and the neighbors still knew the names of each other's pets. Her rented home was separated from Iris's cottage only by a thick privet hedge, which the elderly woman trimmed with a pair of oversized shears and the infinite patience of someone who owned the entire day. And there Iris was, right on cue, sitting in her wicker rocking chair on the porch, her reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose, and a cotton dish towel draped over her lap. She was watching the quiet street like someone waiting for a traveler who had forgotten to call ahead. When she spotted Catherine, her face wrinkled into a wide, bright smile that warmed her eyes. "Well, look at you, Catherine. You're home early today, sweetheart," Iris called out, waving a frail hand. "Come on up and have some coffee. I just brewed a fresh pot, nice and strong, just the way you like it." Catherine paused by the low wooden gate. For a fleeting second, she considered inventing an excuse about being tired, wanting nothing more than to crawl into bed and hide from the world. But the truth was, she dreaded the silence of her own empty house. Iris was offering exactly what she needed: a well-worn chair, a warm mug, and a presence that demanded no difficult explanations. "Aren't you worried you'll spoil me with all this coffee, Iris?" Catherine asked, offering a soft smile as she walked up the wooden steps. "Spoil you? Nonsense, child," Iris replied, her rocking chair slowing to a gentle halt. "Coffee shared always tastes sweeter than coffee drunk alone. Everybody knows that, though you're too stubborn to admit it. Get on inside before it gets cold." The kitchen was small and constantly smelled of sweet cornmeal and chicory. It featured a faded yellow laminate countertop, a vintage white stove with chipped enamel on the left corner, and a heavy wooden pendulum clock on the wall that lost 5 minutes every single day. Iris had promised to get that clock fixed ever since her husband, Arthur, had passed away 8 years ago. Yet she never actually touched it. To adjust the hands would mean admitting that time continued to march forward, even without Arthur there to wind it. Catherine sat down at the table, which was covered in a floral oilcloth, while Iris carefully poured the dark coffee into a thermal carafe and set down a small plate of warm, freshly baked biscuits. "Eat up," Iris insisted, gently patting Catherine's hand. "You've been looking far too thin lately." Catherine split a biscuit in half, watching the steam rise, and felt a sudden sharp ache in her chest. It meant everything to know there was still someone in the world who noticed whether she was eating enough. She ate slowly, listening to Iris chat about the small, quiet happenings of the neighborhood. The stray cat that had taken to sleeping on the garden wall, the summer storm that threatened to break but never did. Catherine replied in soft, comfortable murmurs, letting the gentle tide of the older woman's voice wash over her like a comforting breeze. Suddenly, Iris paused. She looked at Catherine with the deep, searching gaze of someone who could see right through a brave face. "Did something happen today, my dear?" Iris asked softly. Catherine looked up, genuinely surprised that her mask had slipped. "No, Iris, just a long, tiring day at the office." Iris didn't press her. She simply nodded, stirred her coffee with a small silver spoon, and gently guided the conversation back to the garden. In that quiet decision to respect her boundaries, Catherine felt a profound wave of gratitude. Iris had a rare gift. She noticed everything, yet she invaded nothing. Over the past year, the two women had built a quiet sanctuary of mutual care, based entirely on what went unsaid. They knew when the other was carrying a heavy heart, and instead of asking questions, they simply drew closer, brewed another cup, and found small reasons to stay a little longer. Their quiet friendship had begun nearly a year ago, shortly after Catherine had moved into the neighborhood. She had been entirely alone, unloading heavy cardboard boxes from a rented moving truck in the fading afternoon light. The very next morning, Iris had appeared at her front gate, holding a warm plate covered by a clean gingham napkin. "I made far too much southern squash casserole, and keeping leftovers only sours a kitchen," Iris had said, pressing the warm dish into Catherine's hands, and retreating back to her porch, before Catherine could even think to decline. It was Catherine's first lesson in neighborhood hospitality. You don't argue with a kind gesture, you simply accept it. A week later, Catherine returned the favor with a basket of fresh peaches and a bundle of wildflowers from the market. From that point on, neither woman could quite remember who had started looking after whom. What Catherine did not know, and what Iris rarely spoke of out of a quiet maternal pride, was that the modest wooden cottage they shared coffee in had been purchased entirely by Iris's son, a man who earned more in a single afternoon than the entire neighborhood earned in a year. Iris had raised her son practically on her own, after Arthur's early passing, taking in laundry, sewing wedding dresses, and baking pies to sell at the local school, pinching every single penny until it practically begged for mercy. Her sacrifice had borne fruit. Her boy had studied hard, earned scholarships, built a consulting firm, bought out competitors, and eventually became a name printed in glossy business magazines that Iris didn't care to read. Iris was incredibly proud of him, a pride that swelled in her throat whenever she spoke his name, but she never let it turn into boasting. She had flatly refused his offers of a luxury penthouse in Atlanta, paid vacations to Europe, or a live-in companion to keep her company. "Company is found on the front porch, son," Iris had told him over the phone. "The things I actually want can't be bought with a checkbook." What she wanted, of course, was his time. She wanted his presence. A full, uninterrupted Sunday afternoon, where his sleek smartphone didn't ring every 10 minutes to call him back to a board meeting. He called her, she couldn't deny that. He called every Thursday evening, and the conversation lasted exactly as long as it took for a secretary or an assistant to interrupt him on the other line. He sent generous monthly checks that she quietly deposited into a savings account she never touched. He sent expensive gifts that remained in their cardboard boxes in the closet, and he sent holiday wishes through his personal assistants when he was too busy to write them himself. Iris accepted it all with the same quiet patience she applied to her garden, understanding that her son loved her the only way he knew how, by providing, resolving, and purchasing solutions to problems that money could never actually solve. She harbored no bitterness, only a quiet, polite longing. Far away in his sleek, glass-walled office in Atlanta, the man behind that longing lived in a world that had absolutely nothing to do with slow-dripped coffee and grandfather clocks. Ethan Bennett spent his days high above the city, surrounded by glowing monitors displaying financial projections that rose and fell. He treated the people around him much like those numbers, useful as long as they yielded a return. Earlier that very week, without a second thought, Ethan had signed his name at the bottom of a restructuring list that his executive board had slid across his desk. It was a document containing dozens of names of employees who, to him, were simply redundant overhead. He hadn't read a single one of those names. He wouldn't have recognized them if he had. To Ethan, an employee was a function, not a human being. As long as the quarterly projections remained in the blue, the human cost was merely a necessary adjustment. Just that morning, a young administrative assistant had paused by the doorway of his office, her voice trembling slightly as she asked for a few unpaid days off to care for her ailing father. Ethan had barely looked up from his screen before telling her to coordinate the request with human resources. He hadn't asked her father's name, nor had he asked what was wrong. If someone had tried to tell him that a dismissed employee had a sick parent, a young child, or a mortgage to pay, he would have replied, without anger but with absolute coldness, that a corporation was not an extension of anyone's home. He lived by the firm belief that business and emotion must never mix, and he held himself to that standard with the same unforgiving rigor he expected from everyone else. He signed the document, handed it back to his chief operating officer, and immediately moved on to the next agenda item. And one of the names neatly crossed out on that printed sheet belonged to a young woman who, at that very moment, was sitting in his mother's kitchen on the coast, sharing a quiet breakfast with the woman who had given him life, without either of them having the slightest clue of their connection. Later that afternoon, after Catherine had left with a gentle hug and a promise to return the next day, Iris sat alone on her porch, slowly rocking in the warm, humid air. She watched Catherine's slender figure walk down the street, noting the way the girl's shoulders tried desperately to remain straight, but kept wanting to slump under an invisible weight. Iris knew the difference between simple exhaustion and a heavy heart, but she chose not to pry. She would wait. Waiting was the one thing life had taught her to do with absolute grace. She had waited for a husband who never came home from the hospital. She waited for a son who was always too busy to visit. And now, she hoped that this sweet, quiet girl would eventually find someone to look out for her the way she looked out for others. Catherine, on the other side of the hedge, unlocked her front door, turned on the kitchen light, and stood in front of her empty refrigerator without opening it. She pulled the folded paper from her purse, smoothed it out on the table with her palm, and read the cold corporate words she already knew by heart, searching for a loophole that simply wasn't there. Tomorrow, she would begin the exhausting process of submitting applications, updating her resume, and knocking on doors. But today, she had no strength left for the hunt. Today, she only had the lingering taste of warm biscuits, and the quiet comfort of knowing that if she fell apart, there was an elderly woman next door who would notice her kitchen light going dark earlier than usual, and who would show up at her gate the next morning with a warm plate. She could never have guessed that the fragile thread of friendship, woven over cups of coffee and shared meals, was about to pull her into a story much larger than her own. The next 2 weeks crawled by with the sluggish, agonizing pace of a job search that yielded absolutely nothing. Catherine woke up early every single morning out of habit, even with nowhere to go. She polished her resume, sent out dozens of online applications that vanished into corporate black holes, and knocked on the doors of local businesses only to be met with polite, empty promises of future consideration. Yet, every afternoon, the crushing weight of her anxiety lifted the moment she crossed the garden path to Iris's porch. She would bring a loaf of bread from the corner bakery, a ripe mango, or sometimes just her presence. Iris welcomed her with the exact same joy every time, as if each visit were a beautiful surprise. Catherine never mentioned her job loss, and Iris never asked, but the older woman quietly began making the afternoon snacks more substantial. She would send Catherine home with small containers of leftovers, insisting she had cooked far too much and didn't want it to go to waste. Catherine accepted them gracefully, playing along with the gentle lie, both of them knowing who was truly keeping whom afloat. One warm Tuesday morning, however, the gentle routine shattered. Iris stood up too quickly from her rocking chair, felt the porch spin violently around her, and had to grab the wooden railing to keep from collapsing. It wasn't a severe medical emergency, just a sudden drop in blood pressure and the terrifying realization of what it meant to be old and entirely alone in a quiet house. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Gable, saw her sway through her window, ran over to assist, and in the panic of the moment, did the one thing Iris had always begged her neighbors not to do. She grabbed the old address book by the kitchen phone, found Ethan's private number, and called him. In his high-rise office in Atlanta, Ethan Bennett answered the unfamiliar call with an irritated frown, only to hear a breathless, frantic voice telling him his mother had collapsed. Something deep inside him, something ancient and buried beneath decades of spreadsheets and corporate acquisitions, instantly seized. He canceled 3 major client meetings, ran to the parking garage, and drove toward Savannah with a reckless urgency he hadn't felt in years. He arrived at the cottage in the late afternoon. The house of his childhood, which he had tried so hard to replace with modern luxuries, still smelled of lavender, old books, and chicory. His mother was resting in her armchair with a cool, damp cloth pressed to her forehead, looking far more embarrassed by the commotion she had caused than shaken by her spell. Ethan knelt before her, holding her frail hands, asking a barrage of frantic questions about doctors, medication, and diet, trying desperately to hide how badly his own hands were shaking. Iris looked at her son, his expensive suit wrinkled from the long drive, and offered a soft, watery smile. "You actually came," she whispered. The absolute simplicity of those words stung Ethan more than any lecture could have. "Of course I came, Mom," he said, clearing his throat. He wanted to call specialists, arrange for private nurses, and solve the problem with the effortless efficiency of his wealth. But Iris refused with her usual quiet stubbornness. It was just a brief spell, she insisted. All she needed was a little rest, and for him to sit with her for a little while in the quiet house that had been empty for far too long. Ethan agreed to stay the night, more to satisfy his own anxiety than to understand what his mother truly needed. He sat on the old sofa, loosened his tie, and for the first time in years, looked at the details of the room. He saw his father's old silver watch on the shelf, the handmade lace on the armchair, and a small, empty plate on the table, with a few crumbs left over from a shared afternoon snack. He didn't ask who had been there, completely unaware that the answer was about to walk right through the front door. On the other side of the privet hedge, Catherine noticed the sleek, expensive black SUV parked in front of Iris's gate, and felt a sudden knot of worry tighten in her chest. It was the hour she usually walked over for their afternoon coffee, and the sight of an unfamiliar vehicle made her hesitate. She didn't want to intrude on a family visit, but Iris hadn't been on the porch for 2 days, and her concern for her friend outweighed her hesitation. Holding a small bag of fresh pastries, she walked up the creaking wooden steps and knocked gently on the door, expecting to hear Iris's warm voice calling for her to come in. Instead, the door swung open to reveal a tall man in a crisp white shirt, his collar unbuttoned, his face lined with the exhaustion of the road, and his dark eyes carrying the cold, commanding air of someone who spent his life giving orders. Catherine recognized him instantly. He, of course, did not recognize her. She had seen him walk through the lobby of her former firm without glancing at a single employee, stepping into his private elevator, passing by the desks of his staff as if they were merely office partitions. He was the owner. He was the name at the top of the corporate letterhead, the signature at the bottom of her termination notice, the face she associated with the darkest day of her professional life. And here he was, standing in Iris Bennett's doorway, looking at her with the polite impatience of a busy man interrupted by a stranger. "Yes? Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice smooth and entirely professional. Catherine felt the blood rush to her face, the small bag of pastries suddenly feeling as heavy as lead in her hands. For a split second, she wanted to turn around, apologize for knocking on the wrong door, and run back to her cottage before he could realize the bizarre connection between them. But her pride refused to let her flee. She straightened her back and looked him directly in the eyes. "I came to see Iris," Catherine said, her voice remarkably steady. "I'm her neighbor. Is she all right?" Ethan narrowed his eyes, quietly assessing the young woman in the simple cotton shirt and denim. There was something in the way she held his gaze, without a hint of the deference or intimidation he was accustomed to, that unsettled him. "My mother had a brief spell, but she's resting now," Ethan replied coolly. "Thank you for stopping by." He began to close the door in a practiced, dismissive gesture. But from the living room, Iris's voice called out, weak but sharp. "Ethan, who is that? Is that Catherine? Let her in, for heaven's sake. Catherine, come inside, dear." The name struck Ethan like a sudden splash of cold water. Catherine. He knew that name. Not from his personal life, but from a printed sheet of paper he had signed without looking, just 2 weeks prior. The two worlds he kept strictly separated, the world of bottom lines and the world of his mother's quiet cottage, had collided on the threshold of this old wooden door, and he had absolutely no idea how to navigate it. He looked at her again, really looking at her this time, realizing with a sudden sinking feeling that this was a real person with a life he had altered with a stroke of his pen. "Do you two know each other?" Ethan asked, looking from Catherine to his mother, his voice losing its corporate polish. "Know her?" Iris scoffed gently from her chair. "This girl is the only soul in this neighborhood who cares whether I eat or sleep. Come in, Catherine. Don't mind my son. He has no idea how to welcome guests." Catherine didn't step forward immediately. She looked at Ethan for another long moment, a silent, heavy question hanging in the air between them. Did he know? She could see the sudden realization dawning in his eyes, the subtle shift from irritation to quiet shock. He knew. But she decided right then that she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her feel small, nor would she allow him to turn this into a corporate apology. She lifted her chin, walked past him into the warm living room, and set the pastries on the table. She adjusted the cushion behind Iris's back and asked about her medicine with the comfortable familiarity of someone who belonged in the space. Ethan watched from the doorway, feeling entirely out of place in the home he paid for. When his mother asked him to fetch a glass of water, he walked into the kitchen and realized he didn't even know which cupboard held the glasses. "Second cabinet, bottom shelf," Catherine said quietly from the living room, her voice free of malice or sarcasm, stating it simply as a fact. The fact stung. She knew his mother's kitchen better than he did. Ethan brought the glass back, his knuckles white around the cold glass. "Have you been helping her long?" he asked, his tone still carrying a trace of defensive authority. "Every day," Catherine answered, looking him dead in the eye. "For almost a year. And where was I during that year, Ethan?" Iris added, her voice gentle but cutting. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan had no answer, He swallowed his pride and redirected the conversation to the doctor's instructions, but the tension in the room remained thick and heavy. When evening fell and Catherine politely declined an invitation to stay for dinner, she said goodbye to Iris with a warm hug and dismissed Ethan with a polite, chilly nod that felt like a slap to his ego. He stood by the window, watching her cross the narrow garden path back to her cottage. Only then did the full weight of reality settle in his chest. This woman wasn't just a random visitor. She was a constant, vital part of his mother's life. And he, who prided himself on managing vast corporate networks, didn't even know the name of the woman living 3 yards away from his mother's porch. Ethan woke up early the next morning, in his old childhood bedroom, his back aching from the soft mattress, and his mind racing. He had decided, against every business instinct he possessed, to stay through the weekend. He told himself it was out of caution for his mother's health, but deep down, he was consumed by a quiet, restless curiosity about the neighbor who held his gaze so fiercely. At precisely 9 o'clock, the front gate clicked open. Catherine walked up the steps carrying a fresh loaf of bread and a container of sliced fruit. She greeted Iris warmly, offered Ethan a brief nod, and went about tidying up the kitchen with practiced ease. Her complete indifference to his status was infuriating to a man who was used to being the center of gravity in every room he entered. It was Iris who broke the quiet tension, looking at Catherine with maternal concern. "You need to eat more of this bread, Catherine. You're looking far too thin. This is no time to be skipping meals." Then, turning to Ethan, she added, "The poor girl lost her job 2 weeks ago, Ethan. Some big firm downtown just let her go without a second thought." Catherine froze, her butter knife suspended in the air, her face burning with embarrassment. She glared at Iris, silently begging her to stop, but the old woman had already returned to her tea. Ethan, however, felt his stomach drop. "Which firm?" Ethan asked quietly. Catherine looked at him, her eyes bright with a mixture of pride and anger. "Your firm, Mr. Bennett," she said clearly. "Hughes Consulting. I was on the administrative team on the 3rd floor. Until your signature decided I was no longer necessary." The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan sat frozen, his tea cooling in his hand. For the first time in his career, the human cost of a spreadsheet had a name, a face, and was standing in his mother's kitchen. He stood up, needing air, and walked out onto the wooden porch. A few minutes later, when Catherine walked out to leave, Ethan stepped into her path. He had spent the last hour drafting a standard corporate solution in his head, the kind of clean financial resolution that always worked in his world. "Catherine, please wait," Ethan began, his voice hesitant. "About what my mother said. I didn't personally draw up those lists. There are committees, managers, metrics. But my name is on the door. I want to make this right. I can arrange a severance package or find you a position at another firm in our network. Just give me a number." Catherine looked at him, her expression shifting from anger to a profound, weary sadness. "Do you honestly think everything can be resolved with a number, Ethan? I'm trying to fix an injustice," he insisted, his voice sincere but clumsy. "No, you're trying to buy yourself a clear conscience," Catherine replied, her voice low and sharp. "There's a difference. Even if you offered me my old job back today, I would never accept it. I don't want to work for a man who crosses out lives on a piece of paper without ever looking them in the eye. And frankly, you shouldn't be worrying about my bank account. You should be worrying about the woman sitting inside that house, who spends every single day waiting for a son who only shows up when she collapses. That is the account you're behind on, Mr. Bennett, not mine." She walked down the steps, leaving him standing on the porch with his hollow offer hanging in the warm Georgia air. He stayed on the porch for a long time, watching the sun dip below the horizon, her words ringing in his ears. When he finally went back inside, he began to notice the quiet, invisible details of the house that his wealth had never provided. On the refrigerator, A handwritten note from Catherine detailed his mother's medication schedule. In the bathroom, a sturdy metal grab bar had been professionally installed near the tub. He knew, without asking, that he hadn't paid for it. Every corner of the cottage bore the marks of a daily, unpaid, loving devotion that no bank transfer could ever replicate. That evening, as he shared a simple dinner with his mother, Iris looked at him with a tender, serious expression. "Do you know what I love most about Catherine, son? She never looks at me with pity. She sits with me, she argues with me, she laughs with me, and then she comes back the next day. Some people give you everything but offer you nothing. And some people have nothing, yet they give you the most expensive thing in the world, their time." Ethan spent the next several weeks split between his corporate office in Atlanta and his mother's cottage in Savannah. He began traveling down every single weekend, delegating tasks he once insisted on micromanaging. The transition was clumsy at first, but slowly, a fragile truce began to form between him and Catherine. One Saturday afternoon, a sudden summer downpour exposed a leak in Iris's porch roof. Ethan, dressed in a damp linen shirt, was struggling on a wooden ladder to adjust a loose shingle he had absolutely no idea how to fix. Catherine stood below, holding the ladder steady, watching his clumsy efforts with an amused smile. "Get down before you break your neck, city boy," she teased. "Let someone who actually knows how to use her hands do it." She climbed up, adjusted the slate in 2 swift motions, and climbed down with soot on her fingers, and a genuine laugh on her lips. It was the first time she had smiled at him, and Ethan found himself laughing along, a warm, rusty sound he hadn't heard from himself in years. Later that evening, as a storm rattled the windows, the three of them sat around the kitchen table sharing a pot of chamomile tea. Under the soft glow of the kitchen light, Iris began to talk about the past. She spoke of the hard years after Ethan's father died, of working late into the night sewing dresses, and of the day a 15-year-old Ethan had come home, sat at this very table, and told her he had gotten a job as an office runner so she wouldn't have to work so hard. "He was only 15, Iris murmured, her hand gently resting on Ethan's, carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. "I wanted him to just be a boy, but hunger makes men out of boys very quickly." Ethan looked down at his teacup, his voice quiet, as he spoke of a memory he had never shared with anyone. "I remember the day of Dad's funeral," he whispered. "We had so little. I made a promise to myself that day that we would never, ever be at the mercy of poverty again. I wanted to build a wall of money, so high that nothing could ever hurt us. I built the wall, Catherine, but somewhere along the way I forgot that walls keep people out too. I thought caring was a liability." Catherine looked at the powerful executive sitting across from her and, for the first time, saw the wounded boy beneath the armor. She realized his coldness wasn't born of malice, but of a deep, ancient fear of vulnerability. Without a word, she reached across the table and placed her hand over theirs. The seasons shifted, and the humid summer gave way to a crisp, golden Georgia autumn. The weekends in Savannah had transformed Ethan. He spent his days sitting on the porch with his mother, learning to listen without looking at his watch, and helping Catherine carry groceries from the local market. He found himself falling deeply in love with the headstrong, independent woman who had refused to let him buy her respect. Back in Atlanta, his corporate world began to reflect his internal shift. He called a meeting with his executive board, demanded a full review of the recent layoffs, and personally worked to reinstate several positions, implementing a new corporate policy that prioritized employee retention and family leave. But his heart remained in Savannah. One afternoon, after discovering through Iris that Catherine was falling behind on her rent, Ethan quietly paid her landlord for the entire year ahead. He thought it was a gesture of pure love, but he had failed to realize that to a woman who had fought for her independence every single day of her life, an unsolicited financial rescue felt like an act of patronizing pity. When Catherine found out, she confronted him in his mother's kitchen, her eyes flashing with a mixture of betrayal and pride. "Who gave you the right to manage my life, Ethan? Do you think I'm just another project for you to resolve so you can feel like a good person? If you see me as a charity case, then we have nothing left to say to each other." Ethan returned to Atlanta that night with a crushing weight in his chest. His mother's words echoed in his mind. "Catherine doesn't need you to save her, Ethan. She needs you to believe she is strong enough to save herself." Wealth cannot buy partnership. For 2 long weeks, Catherine refused his calls. She returned every penny of the rent money to her landlord, working double shifts at a local boutique to secure her own home. But, in the quiet evenings, as she looked out at the dark cottage next door, she felt a profound, aching silence. She missed his laughter, his clumsy attempts at helping, and the quiet warmth of his presence. The silence was shattered on a cold Tuesday winter night. Catherine's frantic call woke Ethan in Atlanta at 3 in the morning. Iris had suffered a severe stroke. Ethan drove through the dark Georgia night like a man possessed, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he prayed a desperate, silent prayer for more time. When he burst through the doors of the Savannah hospital, he found Catherine waiting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway, her face pale and her eyes swollen from crying. The moment she saw him, all pride and anger dissolved. She ran into his arms, and he held her tightly, the two of them weeping together in the quiet corridor. "She's stable, Ethan," Catherine whispered against his shoulder. "But the doctors say the next 48 hours are critical. She kept asking for you." For the next 3 days, Ethan did not leave his mother's bedside. He slept on a plastic chair, helped her sip water, and held her hand as her speech slowly began to return. Catherine remained by his side, sharing meals from the hospital cafeteria and quiet conversations in the dim light of the recovery room. One evening, as Iris slept peacefully, Ethan turned to Catherine. "I'm stepping down as active CEO," he said softly. "I've appointed a trusted partner to run the daily operations in Atlanta. I'm moving back to Savannah permanently. I want to build a life here, near my mother. And if you'll let me, Catherine, I want to build a life with you, not to save you, and not to manage you, but to walk beside you as an equal." Catherine looked at the man who had stripped away his armor, offering her nothing but his honest, vulnerable heart. She smiled, her eyes tearing up, and pulled him into a deep, long-awaited kiss. Iris made a slow, miraculous recovery, returning to her beloved cottage just in time for the spring blooms. The cottage was no longer quiet. Catherine moved her sewing business into the front room, her custom dress designs quickly becoming the talk of Savannah's historic district, entirely funded by her own hard work. They were married on a warm afternoon in Iris's backyard, under the shade of a massive live oak draped in Spanish moss. There were no corporate sponsors, no grand displays of wealth, just a table covered in hand-embroidered linens, a fresh pot of chicory coffee, and the laughter of the neighbors who had watched their story unfold. Iris stood proudly by the porch, holding her cane, tears of pure joy slipping down her weathered cheeks. She raised her coffee mug to the newlyweds, her voice steady and clear in the warm afternoon breeze. "My beautiful children," she smiled, "never forget that a cup of coffee shared will always carry you further than the greatest fortune kept to yourself." In the twilight of our lives, when the frantic noise of the world begins to fade, and the grand structures we spent our youth building reveal themselves to be nothing more than temporary scaffolding, a quiet and profound truth begins to settle in the heart. We spend the better part of our strength running after security, convincing ourselves that if we can only gather enough resources, build high enough walls, or secure enough titles, we will finally be safe from the vulnerabilities of being human. We mistake the accumulation of things for the cultivation of a life. But the old, who have watched the seasons turn and the years slip away like sand through worn fingers, know that the only currency that retains its value at the end of the day is the love we gave, and the presents we offered to those who walked the road with us. True wealth is never measured by what we can write a check for, but by the quiet, daily devotions that money can neither command nor replicate. It is found in the patience to sit on a porch and listen to a story we have heard a dozen times before, in the willingness to show up when there is nothing to gain, and in the humility to recognize that every human being we cross paths with carries a universe of dignity, sorrow, and hope within them. When we treat the world as a transaction, we reduce our own lives to a ledger, turning the beautiful, messy comedy of human connection into a cold column of profits and losses. But when we dare to step down from our high towers, when we allow ourselves to be seen in our weakness and our hunger, we discover that the most sacred spaces are always the simplest ones: a quiet kitchen, a shared loaf of bread, and a hand to hold when the night grows dark. For those of us who have walked this earth long enough to see the paint peel and the gardens grow wild, we understand that time is the only truly non-renewable resource. We cannot buy back a single yesterday, nor can we secure a promise for tomorrow. All we are given is the fragile, beautiful present, and the choice of how we fill it. Let us fill it with the courage to be vulnerable, the strength to respect the independence of those we love, and the wisdom to know that the greatest gift we can ever offer another person is not our protection, but our presence. In the end, when the grandfather clock of our lives strikes its final hour, we will not remember the numbers on our balance sheets or the battles we won in the grand arenas of ambition. We will remember the warmth of a hand in the dark, the shared laughter over a simple meal, and the quiet comfort of knowing that we did not have to walk the long, winding road home all by ourselves.